Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Q&A with John Vervaeke here on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord. My name is Brett, and we welcome John once again. Thanks, John, so much for being here.
Always a pleasure, Brett.
So I want to get to the questions quickly, but first, you recently had another published talk with Jordan Peterson, and this time with uh, with Bishop Barron and Jonathan Pajot. And I wondered if you could just give us it was a great talk, but I wondered if you could give us your reflections on that talk.
And then also did a follow up with Jonathan Pajot. He did a follow up video. I really, really enjoyed it a lot. I thought we really started to get some momentum going. Um, I felt everybody was coming in good faith, no pun intended. And people were listening to each other, responding to each other, um, drawing each other out. And I think Jonathan and I carried that into the discussion we had, and we really caught fire a lot. I just thoroughly enjoyed it a lot, and I thought it was very good discussion about meaning and sacredness. And I'd like to do it again at some point.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, we all look forward to that. So our first question tonight is from Nick Redmark, who writes: Sexuality seems to be a powerful, a power. Too, sexuality seems to be.
Brett,
Yep.
hang on a sec.
Yep.
You're cutting in and out a lot.
Oh, let
Brett,
me check if my microphone is properly set up. Oh, it seems
you're
to be.
fine now. You were cutting in, yeah, you were
Okay.
cutting in and out a lot there. Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully my settings look all right. So hopefully it goes okay. So it says sexuality seems to be too powerful a thing to ignore when it comes to spiritual development. How can sexuality be incorporated into the ecology of practices?
I think that's a really important question. And Nietzsche famously said that the height of my spirituality reaches into the depth of my sexuality, or the other way around, depending on how you want to translate the German. Um, so I'm trying to understand this in terms of potentials for modal confusion. Uh, Sexuality can put us into a consumptive, manipulative, controlling frame. Sexuality can open us into the being mode. And insofar as we want to make sexuality part of our spirituality, I would suggest one of the ways we need to do that is by making sure the practice of our sexuality alleviates little confusion and accentuates the remembrance of the being mode. And towards that end, I've been doing quite a bit of reading, trying to understand the deep connections between love and participatory knowing and beauty as the way in which it prepares us for truth and justice, the way Scary says, but also, as D.C. Schindler is arguing, a beauty is a way in which appearance is the appearance of reality, meaning that beauty is a way in which appearances act as a portal towards the depth of something. And then people get confused about that because they confuse all beauty with physical beauty, and so there's a lot of things that need to get apart. So I continue to be deeply, I think, I think this is right to say, profoundly impressed by D.C. Schindler. His book, Love and the Postmodern Predicament, Rediscovering the Real in Beauty, Goodness, and Truth, I think is very relevant to the second part of the answer that I've been giving. Insofar as we can recover sexuality connection with remembering the being mode and alleviating modal confusion, we need to reconnect as deeply as we can sexuality to beauty, um, participatory knowing, and to love, understood as a virtue, not as a feeling. Um, I'm looking forward to reading D.C. Sindler's uh, the book next on my list, which is The Catholicity of Reason, which isn't about Catholicism. It's about trying to understand reason in its universal aspects. I highly recommend his work. I think he's one of the great Satanists alive today. and he's contributing greatly to the revival of Platonism as not only a viable but a plausible perspective by which we can both frame and perhaps answer these kinds of questions. But that's what I recommend. I recommend we take a deep look first within our own tradition and current deep thinkers and writers like D.C. Schindler. And then, of course, we'd want to take a look at Tantra, both in the Hindu and the Buddhist versions, related things from Taoism, to see if sexuality is being integrated into spirituality in ways that are transferable to us and that can be put into dialogue with our own Western legacy coming out of the Platonic tradition.
Thank you. Ryan asks, I am following the leading depth psychotherapists on YouTube, in my humble opinion, Young to Live By. They wrote a book entitled IPSA, Institute for Psychosystems Analysis, Volume 3, and Personal Myth Guide by Stephen and Pauline Richards. This book was created to help the average individual to properly relate to their own unconscious. It is the first step to building up one's own psychological immunity and ego strength. Is this vastly important tool something you have come across in your work? If not, are you interested? And he also asks, do you have any clinical or frontline experience with your work?
So I'm not familiar with that specifically, although I am following the post-Jungian work, especially coming through Raf and others, and also the work coming, although I don't think they explicitly acknowledge it, but all the work coming through internal family systems theories. So I think the practices that open up the dialogical relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, you need those practices within an ecology of practices. Um, and this goes back again to the Socratic daemon, Antisthenes saying that he learned from Socrates how to dialogue with himself, the Neoplatonic tradition of theurgia. So this is all, I think, well placed. So I'm interested in the genus. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I have the time to take up looking at all specific versions or instances or particular technologies that are emerging. Um, but I do think psychodynamic process that opens up the dialogical relationship between the unconscious and the conscious is um, is important. I think Jung is one of the people we should be reading about this. There are, of course, many others. There's Corban, and then, of course, there's the work of Schwartz and all the IFS people. And then also, like I said, Raff's work on the alchemical imagination and ally work and whatnot. Some of the work done on personification within some of the other practices. Uh, even Gendlin's focusing can be seen as a kind of imagistic dialogical practice. Um, I'm trying to understand as many of these as I can, but I can't understand. I can't review them all. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to cop out, but I'm trying to figure what is in common. What's the general feature? What can we draw from all of these as a basic kind of practice? There's some discussion of this in the anthology. It was called Inner and Outer Dialogues because it was called that because the inner work, the inner dialogue was part of it. Uh, at the publisher's request, Chris and I have agreed to change the title of the book to Dialogos. Um, but that inner dialogue is an essential part of all of this. Clinical experience, I went through Jungian therapy. I did multiple Jungian workshops. I did training in emotion-focused therapy. I actually did a bit of a therapeutic practicum. I don't consider myself a psychotherapist, but I do consider myself somebody who has a significant amount of clinical experience. That answers the question.
Jamez writes, I'm wondering about the zone of proximal development and whether there are physiological signs that one is in that place mentally. Not trying to sound like I think I have some special ability, but I've had experiences where my perspective felt as though it had been shifted to the being mode for a time, and I became hyper aware of a flow of chills running through my body until the time when I started ruminating and worrying like I normally would. It's also occurred to me that I stand up straighter when I'm focused on the being mode. As a follow up, can a shift in perspective begin with the body, or does it always have to start with a cognitive acceptance or understanding? Thank you for your time and for everything that you do.
Thank you. I'm doing work with a student. It's an independent study project, fourth year project, um, in which he is proposing that the chills that run up and down your spine, um, are in fact predictors of cognitive exploration, that people can be properly educated to induce these as a way of driving cognitive exploration. He and I are going to take this work and we're going to write it up into something and seek publication. I think in my mind, this is just fantastic work on embodied cognition. I think it's quite likely there are physiological and psychosomatic markers of radical shifts in perspective. Um, Neil and I, when we were doing the work on flow, we talked a bit. We didn't end up putting too much in there about the overlap between flow markers and zone of proximal development markers. So I expect that zone of proximal development will have high cognitive fluency markers, insight markers, potentially flow markers. I think this is all, and I think we see in various traditions, especially one that I'm very familiar with, Taoism, the induction of cognitive change via first inducing the relevant physiological change. So I think this is all well said, and I'm really happy about this work that I'm doing with my student because I think it goes towards showing how clearly some of our highest spiritual aspirations are grounded in some very basic, one might even say primitive, physiological responses. Um, how deeply embodied our spirituality is, and how investigating this could actually afford uh, increasing people's spirituality. So the piloerection, goosebumps, chills, they form a family of responses, do tend to heighten people's sense of the spirituality. So, like like things that have been done, like when people are listening to music, have the room they're listening to be slightly more chill with a lot of people around, because social presence also is a contributing factor. People are much more likely to get those aesthetic chills, and this can actually drive their appreciation of the music in a way that Agnes Callard would probably approve of. So this is all deeply fascinating to me. There's going to be more of this happening. Um, they're still just scratching the surface. We talk about it. I talk about it. And I'm criticizing myself here, so I don't mean to be. I'm not trying to sound a promotion. I'm trying to do the opposite. I talk about it. We talk. Oh, embodiment, embodiment. But man, we're just scratching the surface about what that means, and we're still so enthralled by computational metaphors, linguistic language metaphors. Cognition is like a computer, or cognition is like a sentence. That it's going to take a long time. I predict that I'll be dead before we really come to the depths of understanding and of appreciation of our embodiment. But I'm hoping the work that I'm doing on my own and with this student is so gifted, will help to bring this about. The work I'm doing, I can say her name because we have a public video together with Anna Riedel on the third big shift in rationality and how embodied it is, and the work of Rolla on the embodied aspects of rationality. We're just scratching the surface. like I said, we're still so enthralled with our computational and linguistic metaphors. It's very hard for us to appreciate embodiment. Evan, Evan Thompson showed the way in a lot of ways. I think, yeah, I mean, Evan's already a really important thinker, but I think Evan is going to rise in prominence um, as we come to a deeper appreciation of embodiment.
And just for the audience who don't know, can you just briefly explain what zone of proximal development is?
Oh, yes, this is Vygotsky. I just got a very good book on Vygotsky. I can't remember the title of it, but it's basically a recent book exploring Vygotsky's relationship to philosophy, because he was actually very philosophically astute. The zone of proximal development, as proposed by Vygotsky, is where human beings do their best learning. So you can think of this as like of areas to which a child is exposed. One sort of area of exposure is everything the child can, any problems or learning the child could do on its own. So in that sense, the child can basically assimilate or accommodate as needed on their own to whatever challenge they're trying to solve, whatever information they're trying to learn. Then you can think of, certain problems and challenges and topics for learning that the child couldn't learn even with the best adult help. So, no, right, the 5-year-old just, you couldn't teach them Heidegger no matter how good the teacher was, kind of thing, or something like that. In between zone of what the child can learn on its own and what the child can't learn, even with the best adult supervision, is what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. This is the zone in which the child can learn the adult's presence and help and scaffolding, and most importantly, perspective is needed in order for the child to learn. This is one of the problems, the fundamental problems with autodidactism is it's very hard to be in the zone of proximal development, properly understood, because it's very hard to get that other perspective needed on the material one is trying to learn. And so Vygotsky proposed, and there's evidence to support him, that we learn best in the zone of proximal development. And we do that ultimately by first imitating and then internalizing perspective, the more encompassing and penetrating perspective of the adult or the mentor, if we're both adults, that is helping us. That's the zone of proximal development. And it has deep analogs to flow state, because in the flow state, there are problems you can solve and things you can learn, but only by sort of stretching your skills by insight.
Thank you for that. Pat writes, in the axial age, you mentioned the Hebrew notion of faith as da'ath and as a participation with God in the co-creation of the open future. And this is part of the narrative of a narrative understanding of history. My question is this. In what way is that participation in relation to an open future, if it's embedded within a narrative teleology? Or is faith as da'ath not teleological? Also, was the Christian notion of teleology prior to or influenced by Aristotle's notion of final cause? Thank you.
Okay, so this is a very good question. The question of whether or not our sense of participating in the open future requires that there be a teleology for that future. And I have been arguing, and people have been arguing against me continually, and that's good. Just had a great discussion with Sam about this, Sam Adams. I've been consistently arguing that our participation in the course of the unfolding of reality, of continuity of contact into the open future, does not require teleology. And just to put my reasoning in sort of a nutshell, there's a lot more here, but just to, I take the model that's behind Ath of, a sexual romantic union or relationship. My union with my beloved, to my mind, has an open future in it, and we are participating in maintaining a continuity of contact with the co-creation of that future. I do not think that there is any teleology to it. I do not think that the future in any way pre-exists or is there drawing us or guiding us forward. Um, and in fact, one of my criticisms of romantic comedies as one of the great evils of our society is because they present people's da'ath as being cosmically ordained, that there is a plan, there's a teleology, and all the evidence we have, the overwhelming tragedy, pain found within love, especially romantic love, I think is just good evidence that it is not teleological in nature. I mean, somebody might make a Darwinian argument that love is is the telos of producing children. Um, but I doubt that. I think instead, and this is a very Platonic argument and a Thomistic argument, um, that love is for its own sake. And insofar as there's deep interconnections between love and da'ath, faith in that sense, I think the connection is for its own sake. And Jordan Hall and I have talked about this as continuity of contact rather than the attempt to get any kind of foreclosure on the future. I'm just astonished by, I think astonished is the right word, although we often give a positive value. I'm just astonished by the amount of suffering in our relationships and the way we tend to fail much more than we succeed. And we keep returning back to them. And so it's hard for me to understand that as teleological, but that is the primary metaphor. It's used for the Old Testament notion of faith. I think the idea of the open future predates Aristotle, probably in Zoroastrianism. I certainly think that it comes into Christianity before Christians come into contact with Aristotle. Although by the time they do, by the time you get to Augustine, it's getting assimilated pretty powerfully into the Christian model of the kairos. That's another good question to ask, is whether or not the notion of a kairos is possible without it being teleological. I would argue that evidence for kairos, like the axial revolution, and it's hard to see this as anything of a teleological nature. It certainly seems to be a fundamental shifting in the course of events that changes the possibility space for an entire culture or civilization. So I hope I've answered the question. I tried to answer it as completely, but also as briefly as I could. Like I said, this is a huge discussion, and there's a lot of nuance and variation about what we mean by teleology. My colleague Dennis Walsh and one of my former students, Alex Djurjevic, have a notion of teleology drawn out of the philosophy of biology that is not like Aristotle's final causation. I think there's plausibility to this, but that's very different from how most people use teleology, very different from how people use the idea of final cause or purpose. So that's why the discussions elsewhere tend to be much longer, and I've had multiple ones around them. And I guess I would like one of my questions answered about this at some point, which is why do people care about this so much? I suppose I have one answer, which is, purpose and the narrative structure of things contributor to a sense of meaning. Why are we wedded to this so deeply? And I mean that as an open question. I don't mean that as an insulting way. It's all in there so other people can ask other questions.
All right, Struan, you've got a question for John.
Hi, John.
Hi, Struan. As always, it's good to hear from you.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed your conversation with Sam, and I actually wanted to pick up on that a little bit. You said, well, one of the things that you've come up with recently is that you're looking for a Platonism that is post-nominalist.
Yes.
And in your conversation with Sam, you went into quite a bit of depth about the distinction between the formal cause and the final cause.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
way that you described the formal cause was that it was the structural functional organization. And I was
Yes.
wondering if you had ever considered the idea that that maybe instead of having the formal cause as the structural functional organization, you split that role in two, so that the formal cause is responsible for the structural organization, and then the final cause would be responsible for the functional organization, and then the two together would be responsible for the structural functional organization.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could conceive of that, and then if you can, what the consequences to that kind of approach would be to your worldview.
Um. So, first of all, I can conceive of it. I think one of the things that would come out of that would be um, the notion of function for final cause would be very much what Dennis Walsh and Alex Vervaeke and others are talking about. That when we are invoking function, we are invoking a particular type of explanation in which we're talking about how things are conducive to certain ends, which isn't to really strictly attribute a final cause to things, but to talk about affordances as real and important. Um, so, I guess for me, the problem I have with just making final formal cause structural is it leaves out a sense of activity, trying to use a neutral term, like in Spinoza's sense, to the formal cause. The fact that it's shaping possibility in an important way. And that's why I like to have the functioning in. And that's why I like to have function with the formal cause in order to get that notion of shaping. Because that's typically what we mean by function, that possibilities have been shaped in a certain way. Um, like I said, do you think that we have to get clearer about how we can ground a notion of functionality is not just dependent on our goals and preferences. Like Sam's example of the polar bear's white fur functions to help camouflage them seals, and that's that's a good explanation, but we shouldn't think of it as there's a goal state that's out there that's drawing uh, the polar bears into satiation or something like that. But of course, but I take his point to be very well made. Um, yes, Jordan, you can hear it in my voice. I'm sort of struggling around this. Like I said, I'm not happy completely to separate them for the reasons I've given. I am do want to keep talking and reflecting on. And I'm going to go back and reread Dennis's stuff. Um, connections between function. Sorry, I don't know why somebody's calling me. The connections between function and formal causation, the shaping of possibility. But I don't know. That was a bit rambling. I don't know if you can do anything with that, but I'm just pretty much thinking aloud with you right now.
Yeah, I think I'll have to chew that over a bit. I don't have anything really insightful to add right off the bat. Obviously, I do think that I mean, we're talking about a recapitulation of the causes, right? So, for
Yeah.
example, you know, well, I would say that you know, like the modern notion of a material cause is very different from Aristotle's notion of a material cause.
It is.
Um,
It is.
y-
In fact,
yeah, and so
the two notions have bled together, material and effective, in some ways that have not been properly clarified. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
yeah, no, I just wanted to say, like, you know, and the potential has been stripped out of that, and so well, it's quite interesting to me that you actually mention possibility as you do, because I think that possibility and potentiality is also one of those things that needs to be maybe distinguished. And I'm quite partial to putting the potentiality aspect of it into the final cause, but I don't know if that's something that you'd be comfortable with. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm basically also just kind of exploring this space as well.
That's good. I mean, this is very much on the horizon, and being out of object which to try and talk about these is tricky and difficult, and we have been embedded in a substance metaphysics rather than a participation metaphysics for a very long time. That's also, I think, D.C. Schindler's argument about this, and Clark and others, and Paul Tyson. It really prevents us from appreciating these understanding of the causes, because we still think of them in substantial ways rather than in participatory ways. Happy, very much appreciated the discussion with Sam. I thought it was genuine dialogos, and I like what we're doing here, sort of bouncing and probing each other.
Yeah, no, and also, I mean, I did definitely see some of the seeds of what I said to you in the previous Q&A come through in that conversation as well. So it was also kind of gratifying. So, yeah,
very much.
I
try to give you credit when we're here, and but it's hard for me to keep track of everything. If you feel I haven't given you due credit at some point, let me know, and I'll try to address that.
Yeah, no, well, I think, as I've said to you before, that the furthering of the conversation is what the highest priority is. It's not really about who gets credit where, at least not for me. But thank you very much, John. Anyway, I don't want to take up any more time. There's quite a lot of people are waiting. So, yeah, again, thanks, John. Cheers.
Thank you. John, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Chris, you have a question for John.
How's it going, John? It's good to hear from you.
Hey, Chris.
Thanks. So I recently just read Heidegger's essay called The Thing, and I got a deeply religiously impactful kind of experience by reading that essay. In that essay, he asks, well, one, what is a thing? But on a secondary note, he's also asking about what does it mean for something to be real for me. So there's just 2 points that I'd like to point you to and how to prose the discussion that he speaks about in that essay. One is that he mentions, he opens the essay by saying that technology has conquered all distances. Modernization and globalization has made it so that we can now, scroll through Instagram, and we can now be in Hawaii and then scroll down, and now be in Costa Rica and now scroll down, and we can constantly be having this context changing. And what's happening is that this technology, such as even the radio and and airplanes being able to travel so quickly to other places, it's creating this unitization of format. So what's happening is that this samatization of view is happening. Everything's becoming the same. Everything's collapsing into itself, and this has to do with the meaning crisis. So he brings up this point, which is interesting. But he also brings up in his kind of object ontology part of the essay, he brings up this idea of the jug. And he says that science has made the jug be this thing that we fill it with air molecules, and it holds liquid and has this void. But there's also this aspect that where we use the jug, such as when we're pouring it. When we're pouring the jug, we're kind of giving out. We're offering. There's this deeper and fuller sense that he's trying to say in that essay about what does it mean for something to be real. And I would just like your opinion about, well, one, how is technology kind of pervading our sense of the real? That's question number one. And question number two, how do we find ourselves to be more to come back to return to that sense of the real, and for what it means to to feel as if things are real around you.
I think that, wow, that's great, and I'm glad that you had the religious experience. I think that's the appropriate response. Pearl in the thinking being metaphysics in the classical tradition argues that the appropriate response to being is reverence and a religious experience. He explicitly says that. I mean, this preamble to say any answer I'm going to give is going to be really inadequate, because these are very profound questions. Um, here's a bit of a shot at it, and this has been inspired somewhat by Heidegger, also inspired more by the relationship between Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, and Merleau-Ponty's sort of rejection of Husserl's proposal that eidetic reduction could get us to the complete or final essence of a thing. And that's why I've been doing all this work around, and other people are picking it up, and I'm happy about that, around eidetic eduction as opposed to eidetic reduction, and how this, I think, is a way of trying to understand what Plato meant by eidos. What does all of this have to do with your question? One of the things that is revealed when we're using the jug or talking about the jug or painting the jug is multi-aspectuality of the jug, the multi-aspectuality, in fact, of everything. And I'm doing sort of scare quotes right now. And what's really powerful about the multi-aspectuality is, first, it is inexhaustible, any object, especially if you extend the aspectuality in an imaginal fashion, which Corbin, of course, strongly recommends. And of course, in a conceptual fashion, as Plato recommends it. So the aspects of anything is inexhaustible, but not disclosed to us chaotically. There's a through line running through it. And to me, this is closer. This is where Merleau-Ponty, I think, is better than Husserl. I don't think that through line is completable. I don't think it corresponds to anything like Aristotelian essence. I think it instead is that which is properly realized by us in reverence and awe, which is the simultaneity, the continuity, but within this multi-aspectuality. And that continuity is not itself another aspect. It is non-aspectual. There's a no thingness, non-aspectuality to it. And I think this is how we're getting close to what Plato meant by the form of something.
Right.
And technology and science do, and I think Heidegger's bang on about this. This is like, let me try to go very carefully here. I think Quine is right that what science does is determine the categories that have essence, those that don't, but essence in a very specific fashion, which is our ability to make broader and broader, potentially universal generalizations. So all gold has this atomic weight, etc., or atomic number, I should say, etc. And I think what that has done is confused that, or maybe we've fused and therefore hidden, but we've confused that essentialization, which is a proper function of science, with the eidos of a thing. And science in that way is deeply blinding of the eidos of a thing. Its success is precisely what blinds us, because we tend to think that once we have the scientific image of the thing, we have the completed essence of the thing.
Right.
If we take that stand, then we do what Aquinas and Plotinus and Plato don't want us to do. We separate essence from being, and we separate essence from eidos. And I think that's a fundamental mistake.
Right. The fact that he's getting out of that eidos, in his way of talking about earth and sky, divinities and mortals, and saying that the way in which those gather is what creates a thing. That is something that I was raised Catholic, and it's just to make the comment that when I for example thought about praying, I didn't give it any thoughts, but like the way in which I now see praying as something like this offering, this giving, this multi-spectual thing that releases you from the eidos is something that's like a very beautiful, kind of impactful, it was a deeply felt experience that I had when reading him.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if you're using the phrase the way I think you're being released to the eidos, and you're being freed from the scientific essence. If you take a look at compare Plato's sense of the eidos and the fact that, for example, many of the dialogues end propositionally incomplete, the eidos can't be captured, and compare that to, I don't know if this isn't quite right for Aristotle, but certainly for Aristotelians, the idea of an essence as a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. You're being freed from the latter for the former, I would argue. Let's remember that the original meaning of eidos it is the look of something. It is properly translated by our word aspect. What Plato's trying to get at is that which is beyond all the aspects that holds them all together, because they don't fragment in their intelligibility, is really a profound thing, even perceptually. And Merleau-Ponty goes on about this. Like he's trying to get people to wake up to that you can't exhaust the aspectuality of a thing, but that doesn't mean that it's never that one well, I wouldn't say never, but it's almost always the case that one aspect impregnates you for the next aspects, even though there could be significant non-identity. Like if you think about looking at your phone head on and then tilt it towards you so all you're looking is the top level, those two aspects are just really different from each other visually. Yet there's continuity there. And then if you put in imaginal and conceptual stuff, and so I think one of the great dangers is here. And I'm a scientist, and I think it's important, and I think which categories generalize versus those that don't is really, really important. I think the scientific image, and especially the way the ontology is frozen in technology, we are blinded to the real depth of things, in a way that correspondingly blinds us to the depths within ourselves. Sensibilities, our receptivities, our sensitivities are dulled to the surface because we get locked into one particular aspect as defining the being of a thing. Make any
Great,
sense?
thank you. Now that makes a lot of sense. I thought that Heidegger was not anti-Plato, but against Plato's idea. But
he is. I follow Rakowski and a lot of other people. Heidegger is very pro-Plato until the 30s, and then he turns on Plato, and he accuses Plato of being the father of metaphysics and therefore the father of nihilism. And I think Rakowski is right that this is a somewhat willful misreading of Plato on Heidegger's part. And
because I interpreted the eidos as form. I interpreted the eidos as form, like just the form of the way in which we fall into our notions, right?
And to be fair to you, that is a traditional reading of the eidos, but third wave Platonism is really breaking free from that reading, Plato, and it's much better for explaining drama and what unfolds in the dialogues than the standard interpretation of what we mean by the forms.
I'll look into that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Gonzalez. Take a look at Gonzalez. That's the place to start.
Thank you so much, Chris. Richard, you have a question for John.
Yeah, so I kind of like to go in continuity with that, but sort of broaden it out a bit, because, and sort of bring in Jonathan Peugeot here. Because sorry, did I hear someone come in?
I said yes, please. I always welcome that connection.
All right. And so I think Jonathan has a lot of similar ideas and arguments concerning the way that human beings view something like the eidos, and the inability for at least science as we currently are embodying it, it has an inability to capture that. And so I'd like to broaden that out in a bit, in a sense that I'd really like to start a journey of getting a really solid grasp on really all of the inabilities of science to take into account human phenomenology and perspective, etc., in a Peugeotian way, but do that in somewhat of a more academic context. So sort of what I would like to hear from you is sort of what you think all of the 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 insufficiencies of science are, and how our current understanding is holding us back from understanding a large part of reality, at least in a similar way that Pico thinks we are. But in addition to that, I'm 17, I'm in my senior year of high school, and I have the intention of going on to study philosophy next year, and I really like to begin a really long and in-depth academic survey of this. So if you could deliver that argument and then also point me to some books or authors where I could really start to build the foundation of that for myself, uh, that would be fantastic.
Um, wow, that's a lot. I mean, um, okay, the the criticisms of science. I don't know quite what. Um, there's science as a practice, then there's science as it is taken up by
Mm-hmm.
popular culture. I don't have many criticisms of science as a practice. Um, Insofar as science uh, becomes an entity bound into technology, the way Heidegger talks about, then I have
Mm-hmm.
criticisms of it about how it enforces propositional tyranny, how it often confuses essence with eidos. You just heard that. So those are some of the criticisms I have. Um, I think a proper way of addressing this um, would be to look at some of the continental tradition coming out of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty about the inadequacies of science, and this is very much taken up um, by current continental thinkers, especially within 4E cognitive science. But I think it would also be a good idea for you to look at um, recent analytic philosophy of science. If you're really interested in about the inadequacies of science, you got to read Kuhn, you got to read Feuerabend, you got to read Lakatos, you should read Putnam. Um, you want to get there's some really good anthologies out there on philosophy of science things. I recommend that you take a look at that. I recommend you take a look at some of the work that's being produced here at University of Toronto. We have the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science. It's where Dennis Walsh is, and there's lots of work being done there. I think the philosophy of biology, by the way, work done by Dennis and a lot of other people, um, Rosen's What is Life? That's where you can get to the cutting edge where the philosophy of science in a particular way intersects with these issues about embodiment, understanding cognition, um, like that. Um, I think what I'm more concerned with is, I guess, my critiques are mostly meta science. They're about inappropriate ontological and epistemological interpretations of science. I think there are kinds of knowing that science can talk about, but science cannot practice or produce. And I think people have elevated science to a very weird status. I often am perplexed by people simultaneously talk about how important science is and then claim to be reductive materialists because I see I see no such reductive explanation of science itself possible. So the ontological status of science is simultaneously unexplicated and presumed, in a very prejudicial fashion. So my concern is generally on both sides. I think people haven't wrestled as they should, and is being wrestled in the philosophy of science with what is this entity we're talking about? What is it? What is its ontological status? It doesn't sit in the universe the same way rocks and trees do.
Mm.
So what is it, and how does it exist? It of course it has a relationship to our existence. What is the nature of that relationship? It depends on distributed cognition fundamentally, and how does distributed cognition fit into our ontology? Sorry, Richard, I'm going on, and I promised I wouldn't. You can see how how multifaceted and
Yeah.
complex questions are, and I'm trying to give you some names and some advice to get you
Mhm.
started along the way.
Well, and thank you for that, and thank you for at least what I interpret as a hesitancy, at least in response to the way I formulated the question, because I wasn't very specific by using that broad term of science as such, and I agree with you that at least the scientific method has no problems with it per se, but there's more the surrounding structures
Yeah.
that seem to be what one can take issue with. So,
Thank you, Richard.
but yeah,
Sorry, Richard. Sorry, we're running short on time, so we have to move on to the next question. So apologize for cutting you off there. Pablo asks, have you considered dubbing your Aftmc series into Spanish? I'm positive that lots of people who don't speak English could benefit from your lectures. He also would like to know where the data comes from your stat in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis introductory lecture, where you said that the placebo effect is real. 30 to 40% of all real medication, the one we sell as real drugs, is placebo effect.
So the first thing is, yeah, there's lots of people wanting to dub and translate and into various languages. I can't oversee that. I'm too busy. If people want to do that, as long as they give me good reason to believe it will be done in a very professional and accurate manner, they're welcome to do so. Um, Difficulties right now because the book, sorry, the series has been turned into a book, and we have a publisher for the book, and so we have to be careful about description and things like that. But dubbing it into Spanish, as long as you send, a formal email to the Vervaeke Foundation saying good reason and evidence to believe it will be done professionally and accurately, I think that you're welcome to do that. Like I said, I can't think of all the languages. I started on a project with working of trying getting it done into Chinese, but that became too time consuming both for myself and the translator. Um, I can't undertake this project. I welcome it being done, and as long as, again, it's done in good faith, with professionalism, with the relevant expertise, and accurately. So the reason why the basic stat is to look how the control group from almost all clinical trials is basically a placebo, and you can look at how often medicine only goes a certain percentage beyond the placebo. So I'm sort of gathering all of that together in sort of a meta uh, conclusion. The fact that we constantly test against placebo, and the fact that the rate at which medicines typically outperform placebo is not as great as people might expect, points in order for it to get accepted and approved, by the way, is not as great as people might expect. Trying to get people to take notice of the fact that this means that even in the medicines that are improved, a significant amount of the data, of the variance, to use statistical terms, can already be explained by the placebo, precisely because that variance is being generated in the control groups that just have the placebo. So that's the basic argument.
All right. Thank you. And also, for those who are interested in contributing to things like other language dubs or transcriptions, if you DM me, I can put you in touch with Amar, who's been ill, but he's sort of overseeing that type of work as well. So send me, Brett, Pleasure of Doubt, a DM, and I can get you in touch with John's people. This will probably be the last question, unless it's short, but it doesn't look short. Jude, you have a question for John.
Hey, I'll try to keep it short. First of all, let me quickly express my gratitude for everything you've done right now, and let's go. First of all, you've said a lot about. Okay, you've talked a lot about internalizing the sage and how having a master or a mentor can be enriching for basically everyone. I don't have deep access to a physical master, let's say. Let's leave it at that. And so I've been internalizing virtual masters from books and the internet and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's two questions. First of all, do you think that is actually enough? Do you think I should actually search for a closer sage, a closer master? And how would I go about doing that?
So I do think it's enough, and the reason I say that is because of the histories of Stoicism, Buddhism, and Christianity, in which the sage that was internalized is a historical figure. Stoicism was the centuries after Socrates and the philosophy, religion of internalizing Socrates. Buddhism, of course, in a very powerful way, internalizes the Buddha. And, Christianity is about internalizing Jesus of Nazareth. And so I do think you need a community, a group of people to properly internalize a sage, especially a historical figure, because you need to start to unpack that multi-aspectuality and find the through line, really recover that voice. I'm using voice as a metaphor here. And there's practices for doing that. So I do think if you met with other people that shared your choice of a sage and you looked at the best literature on that person, and then you engaged in things like philosophical fellowship, and Lectio Divina, and other internalization practices, that that could very well be sufficient for internalizing the sage, at least in the way that Leo and I meant when we wrote about it initially.
Okay, that actually answers both my questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, and I think I'll end it here if that's okay. And I just wanted to take the last minute to once again express two things. I continue to be impressed by the quality of the questions and the intensity and authenticity. I mean, intensity in authenticity by which they are asked, and also just to express my thanks to Brett, and of course always to Mark, for making all of this possible. So thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you so much, John, for all you do and for being here, and yes, to everybody who asked great questions. Just to note, the December Q&A will be early due to the holidays, so it will be in 2 weeks on December 13th at the same time. So I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks, and to you, John, as well. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Have a great day.